You're listening to the Chapter a Day Bible Study. I'm John Stange, and today we're in 2 Samuel 8, David's Victories and Kingdom. 2 Samuel 8 records a series of military victories that establish David's kingdom in fulfillment of God's promises. This chapter teaches us an important theological truth. The Lord was faithfully establishing the kingdom that he had promised. David's victories weren't ultimately about his expanding political power. These were victories that demonstrated God's faithfulness to his covenant and pointed forward to the perfect king whose kingdom would one day encompass every nation. The chapter opens by describing David's victories over Israel's longtime enemies. He defeated the Philistines and he subdued them, ending years of oppression that plagued Israel during Saul's reign. He also defeated the Moabites, measuring them with a line and sparing only a portion of the population. And while these judgments may seem severe to modern readers of a passage like this, they reflect God's righteous judgment upon nations that consistently opposed his people and practiced great wickedness. David next defeated Hadadezer, king of Zobah, as Hadadezer attempted to strengthen his power near the Euphrates River. David captured thousands of horses, chariots, and soldiers. And interestingly, he hamstrung most of the horses, leaving only enough for a limited number of chariots. This action demonstrated that David wasn't placing his confidence in military strength. The law had warned Israel's kings not to multiply horses for themselves. We see this back in Deuteronomy 17:16. And this was because horses represented military dependence, and would be a demonstration that these leaders didn't really fully trust in God. So they were told not to multiply horses for themselves. In David's life, we can see that David recognized that victory comes from the Lord rather than superior weapons or larger armies. Now, when the Syrians came to assist Hadadezer, they also suffered defeat. The repeated theme of the chapter actually appears in two identical statements. In verse 6 and again in verse 14, we read this: "And the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went." These statements explain everything that follows. David wasn't invincible because of his leadership. His success flowed from God's presence and God's blessing. Every conquered city, every defeated army, and every expanding border testified to the Lord's faithfulness. I think this truth guards us against giving too much credit to human ability. God certainly uses gifted leaders. He does that all the time. He also uses things like wise planning. He also even uses faithful effort. But behind every lasting success stands the gracious hand of God. Whatever victories we experience ultimately belong to him. Well, as David's influence spread, the surrounding nations began recognizing God's blessing upon Israel. Toi, king of Hamath, he heard that David defeated Hadadezer, one of his own enemies, and instead of preparing for war, Toi sent his son Joram to congratulate David and to present David with valuable gifts of silver, gold, and bronze. And I love how David responded. He responded in a notable way in verse 11. It says, "These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he subdued." So what that tells us is that rather than accumulating wealth for personal luxury, David dedicated these treasures to the Lord. He understood that the victories belonged to God, and so that means the spoils of victory rightly belong to God as well. This attitude reflects genuine worship. David viewed his success as a stewardship rather than personal ownership. Everything he gained was held with open hands before the Lord. The chapter concludes by summarizing David's administration. Verse 15 says this: "So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people." This verse describes the kind of leadership God desired. David wasn't just a successful warrior, he was also called to govern with justice and fairness. Strong leadership without righteousness becomes tyranny. But God intended his king to reflect his own just character. And the remainder of the chapter lists David's chief officials, including Joab as commander of the army, Jehoshaphat as recorder, Zadok and Ahimelech as priests, Sariah as secretary, Benaiah over the Cherethites and Pelethites, and David's sons also serving as priests. This growing administration actually reflected the increasing stability of David's kingdom. But still, even this well-ordered government wasn't perfect. Later chapters will reveal failures among many of these very leaders, the men listed in this passage. David himself would soon experience devastating personal sin and all the consequences that came with it. The kingdom reached impressive heights, but it remained an earthly kingdom, and it was led by people who were absolutely imperfect. And I think that reality prepares us to look beyond David to Jesus Christ. 2 Samuel 8 points forward to the greater king whose victories are complete and eternal. Like David, Jesus defeats his enemies, and yet his greatest enemies aren't neighboring nations. His enemies are sin and Satan and death itself. And through his death and his resurrection, Christ won the decisive victory that no earthly king could ever accomplish. David extended Israel's borders through military conquest. Jesus extends his kingdom through the proclamation of the gospel. Men and women from every tribe, every language, every people and nation, they will all willingly submit to his gracious rule as they trust him for salvation. We're told that David ruled with justice and equity, but he did so imperfectly. Jesus reigns with perfect righteousness. The prophet Isaiah foretold the kingdom of Christ by saying this in Isaiah 11:4. He says, "With righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth." Every decision Christ makes is perfectly wise, perfectly just, and perfectly holy. David dedicated the treasures of victory to the Lord, but Jesus offered something infinitely greater. He offered himself. Through his willing sacrifice on the cross, he secured the redemption of his people, and he brought glory to his Father. And the repeated statement that the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went, that ultimately points us to the greater truth that every victory of Christ perfectly fulfilled the Father's will. Jesus never fought a battle outside the Father's purpose. Every miracle, every act of obedience, every temptation resisted, every word spoken, and ultimately his death and resurrection, they all unfolded according to God's eternal plan. As believers, we also learn an important lesson from David's victories. Our confidence isn't found in our own strength, resources, or abilities. The Christian life isn't won by human determination alone. True victory comes as we depend upon the Lord. He alone gives strength to overcome temptation. He alone gives wisdom to face difficult decisions, and courage during trials, and endurance during suffering. 2 Samuel 8 reminds us that God's kingdom advances because God himself establishes it. David's victories fulfilled God's promises to Israel, but they also anticipated the far greater reign of Jesus Christ. Well, today, our King sits enthroned at the Father's right hand, reigning over a kingdom that can never be shaken. And one day, every enemy will be completely defeated, and every promise will be fulfilled, and every knee will bow before the King of Kings. But until then, we serve with confidence, knowing that the Lord who gave victory to David has already secured the ultimate victory through his Son, Jesus Christ. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Chapter a Day Bible Study. For more resources to help you in your walk with Christ and your understanding of the Bible, please visit my website at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com. And if you'd like to partner with me by becoming a supporter of this ministry, you'll see a few options to do so, again, at BibleStudyHeadquarters.com or in the description of this episode. As always, thank you for your prayers, thank you for your support, and thank you for your willingness to share this content with others. Have a great day, and I'll see you again right here tomorrow.